John chapter 11, we're going to begin in verse 1. Now a man was sick, Lazarus from Bethany, the village of Mary and her sister Martha. Mary was the one who anointed the Lord with perfume and wiped his feet with her hair. And it was her brother Lazarus who was sick. So the sister sent a message to him, Lord, the one you love is sick. When Jesus heard it, he said, this sickness will not end in death, but is for the glory of God, so that the Son of God may be glorified through it. Now Jesus loved Martha, her sister, and Lazarus. So when he heard that he was sick, he stayed 2 more days in the place where he was. Then after that he said to the disciples, let's go to Judea again. Rabbi, the disciples told him, just now the Jews tried to stone you, and you're going there again? Aren't there 12 hours in a day, Jesus answered? If anyone walks during the day, he doesn't stumble because he sees the light of the world. But if anyone walks during the night, he does stumble because the light is not in him. He said this, and then he told them, our friend Lazarus has fallen asleep, but I'm on my way to wake him up. Then the disciples said to him, Lord, if he's fallen asleep, he'll get well. Jesus, however, was speaking about his death, but they thought he was speaking about natural sleep. So Jesus then told them plainly, Lazarus has died. I'm glad for you that I wasn't there so that you may believe, but let's go to him. Then Thomas, called Twin, said to his fellow disciples, let's go too, so that we may die with him. When Jesus arrived, he found that Lazarus had already been in the tomb 4 days. Bethany was near Jerusalem, less than 2 miles away. Many of the Jews had come to Martha and Mary to comfort them about their brother. As soon as Martha heard that Jesus was coming, she went to meet him, but Mary remained seated in the house. Then Martha said to Jesus, Lord, if you had been here, my brother wouldn't have died. Yet even now I know that whatever you ask from God, God will give you. Your brother will rise again, Jesus told her. Martha said to him, I know that he will rise again in the resurrection at the last day. Jesus said to her, I am the resurrection and the life. The one who believes in me, even if he dies, will live. Everyone who lives and believes in me will never die. Do you believe this? Yes, Lord, she told him. I believe you are the Messiah, the Son of God who comes into the world. Having said this, she went back and called her sister Mary, saying in private, the teacher is here and is calling for you. As soon as Mary heard this, she got up quickly and went to him. Jesus had not yet come into the village, but was still in the place where Martha had met him. The Jews who were there with her in the house, consoling her, saw that Mary had got up quickly and went out. They followed her, supposing that she was going to the tomb to cry there. As soon as Mary came to where Jesus was and saw this, she fell at his feet and told him, Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. When Jesus saw her crying and the Jews who had come with her crying, he was deeply moved in his spirit and troubled. Where have you put him? He asked. Lord, they told him, come and see. Jesus wept. So the Jews said, see how he loved him? But some of them said, couldn't he who opened the blind man's eyes also have kept this man from dying? Then Jesus, deeply moved again, came to the tomb. It was a cave, and a stone was lying against it. Remove the stone, Jesus said. Martha, the dead man's sister, told him, Lord, there is already a stench because he has been dead 4 days. Jesus said to her, didn't I tell you that if you believed, you would see the glory of God? So they removed the stone. Then Jesus raised his eyes and said, Father, I thank you that you heard me. I know that you always hear me, but because of the crowd standing here, I've said this, so that they may believe you sent me. After he said this, he shouted with a loud voice, Lazarus, come out! The dead man came out bound hand and foot with linen strips and with his face wrapped in a cloth. Jesus said to them, unwrap him and let him go. There are many lessons that we can gain from this account, from this passage of Scripture this morning. But this morning I would like to share with you 7 lessons we see from the resurrection of Lazarus. Number 1, I want you to know that God's timing is always perfect. Jesus got word that Lazarus was sick. Now Lazarus was a friend of Jesus. Jesus had eaten with Lazarus and his sisters, Mary and Martha, a number of times. Mary had anointed Jesus' feet with perfume and then had washed his feet with her hair. In other words, Jesus knew these folks. They were some of the people that Jesus was probably the closest with on all the earth. So the sister sent word to Jesus, the one you love is sick. One would expect Jesus to pray and instantly heal Lazarus from a distance. He had done that before. Or you might think that Jesus would go to Bethany and heal Lazarus there. I mean, after all, Bethany was just a few miles up the road, and these folks had fed Jesus many times. Why in the world would he not go and heal this friend of his? But Jesus did neither. He waited. I don't know about you, but that's not what I would have expected. And if you were Mary or Martha, that's not what you would have wanted either. Jesus, you're our friend. We have fed you many times. I have washed your feet. Come and heal my brother Lazarus. The Lord does not always work when we want him to, but his timing is always perfect. I remember when I was in seminary, and again when I was a youth pastor, and then when I first started pastoring, I would often tell the Lord how much easier things would be if I had a wife. I often reminded him how much more effective my ministry would be if I had a wife and children. I mean, not everyone wants to listen to a preacher talk about marriage and how to make one work if he's not married himself. So I would tell the Lord, you know, Lord, a wife really would help right now. It really would help if I had children. But he made me wait. And I never would have appreciated the gift he gave me if I had not waited. Sometimes some of us have to grow up a little bit. Mary and Martha wanted Jesus to come and help their brother, but Jesus waited. Because God's timing is always perfect. Second, you don't always know how you will respond, so pray for protection. Look there again, if you will, please, in verse 7. Then after that, he said to his disciples, let's go to Judea again. Rabbi, the disciples told him just now the Jews tried to stone you, and you're going there again? Drop down to verse 16. Then Thomas, called Twin, said to his fellow disciples, let's go too, so that we may die with him. If you remember in chapter 10, the Jews tried to stone Jesus. They wanted to kill him. In John chapter 10, verse 21, they picked up rocks to stone him. And again in verse 39, they tried to seize him, but he eluded their grasp. In other words, from man's perspective, Jesus escaped by the skin of his teeth, because the Jews were doing everything they could to kill him. And now Jesus said, let's go back there again. And the disciples began to look at each other, and they turned to Jesus. Jesus, are you crazy? You barely got out of there alive. They wanted to kill you. They did everything they could to grab a hold of you. You barely escaped, and now you want to go back there again? The disciples couldn't understand. And Jesus said, yeah, we're going to go back. So Thomas turned to the other disciples and says in verse 16, let's go too, so that we may die with him. That's pretty gutsy right there. That takes some nerve. Let's go back with him so that we may die with him. I don't know if that would have been my attitude. But on this day, the disciples decide that being with Jesus is more important than their own safety. So they choose to stay with Jesus. Now these are the same disciples who abandoned Jesus on the night he was arrested. Among these disciples were Peter, the one who denied even knowing him 3 times. And the one who says, let's go die with him. He's the one who, in the upper room, when the other disciples tell him Jesus is risen from the dead, he's the one who said, I ain't going to believe that unless I put my fingers in the nail holes in his hands. Unless I put my hand in a gash in his side, I'm not going to believe it. They had such a great start. They believed that they could stay with Jesus. And in the end, they let him down. You never know how you will respond in a given situation until you are in that situation. On July 8th, 1998, my dad and another deputy were called to the home of Alan Singletary in Geneva. Alan had pulled a gun on his landlord, so my dad and another deputy went to talk to Alan to try to get the situation under control. While they were talking to him, Singletary, standing in the doorway of a shed, reached behind him and came out with a pistol, which he turned and fired at my dad, hitting him in his arm. My dad backed up against a tree, called in on the radio, said that he was hit and not doing well. He stayed there, firing with his uninjured arm, and eventually emptied his weapon, hitting Singletary in the leg. Later, after my dad had passed out from loss of blood, Alan came and shot him several more times, killing him. Other deputies and SWAT came out, and 2 other deputies were shot and wounded that evening. The deputy who was with my dad from the beginning, though he was well trained and armed, never fired his weapon. We like to think that we will act heroically in a given situation. We like to think that we will stand boldly and proudly when called to do so. But we never know how we will act when the chips are down. Thomas and the disciples standing with Jesus that day said, "Let's go die with him." Little did they know that they would soon abandon him and that Peter would deny he even knew him. That's why when Jesus taught his disciples to pray, he said, "Pray, Lord, lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from the evil one." 1 Peter chapter 5, verse 8, we are told, "Be sober-minded, be alert. Your adversary, the devil, is prowling around like a roaring lion, looking for anyone he can devour." I remember discussion among a bunch of preachers and going-to-be preachers in class one day, when it was mentioned that a fellow preacher had been caught having an affair with one of his church members. A number of the guys were crowing about how they would never do something like that. The professor replied, "The reason many of you haven't fallen is because you haven't been tempted." The disciples acted, if not courageously here, at least faithfully. But you don't know how long that faith, that courage will last, so pray. Pray for yourselves. Pray for your brothers and sisters in Christ. Pray for your pastor. Pray. We aren't playing here. Church is not a game. It's not a social club. People's lives are at stake. Their eternity is at stake. People's homes and marriages are at stake. Our children are at risk. Our country is in danger. The church is under attack. There's a reason Paul calls us soldiers and tells us to put on the whole armor of God. And why, after telling us to do so, he tells us to pray all prayers. Pray. Because we don't know how we will respond until we get there. God's timing is always perfect. You don't know how you will respond, so pray for protection. And third, we're reminded that God's power is not limited to the future. Look there again, if you will, please, in verse 20. As soon as Martha heard that Jesus was coming, she went to meet him, but Mary remained seated in the house. Then Martha said to Jesus, "Lord, if you had been here, my brother wouldn't have died. Yet even now I know whatever you ask from God, God will give you." "Your brother will rise again," Jesus told her. Martha said to him, "I know that he will rise again in the resurrection at the last day." Jesus said to her, "I am the resurrection and the life. The one who believes in me, even if he dies, will live. Everyone who lives and believes in me will never die. Do you believe this?" Jesus, talking to Martha, he says, "Your brother will live again." And Martha responded like many of us would. "Yes, Jesus, I know. I know he'll live again at the resurrection. I know you're going to do something great in the future, but I don't know about right now." And Jesus says to Martha, "Martha, I am the resurrection." "Yes, Jesus, I know there's a heaven. I know there will be good there, but I'm not expecting very much right now. I know things will be great there, but I'm not looking for miracles right now. I'm just trying to trudge through. I'm just trying to make it through until something miraculous happens in the future and we'll all end up in heaven. But I'm not looking for much right now. When was the last time you looked for God to do something miraculously right now? Sometimes I'm afraid that we are afraid to pray boldly, to ask God for great things, because we're afraid to have our faith tested. Sometimes I have to be reminded of that as well. I asked y'all a while back to pray about the sale of our little church building. We want to get out of debt here. Wanted to get out of the landlord business. I was growing tired of having to look after that other property, and honestly was tired of having to chase down other preachers to get paid each month. And so I asked y'all to pray we'd sell the building. Well, you started praying. Later, Bonnie came to me and said, I'm going to pray that the property sells in October. Now that's faith right there. That's not some vague, random kind of prayer that we throw up hoping God might hear it. That is, God, I'm believing you. And I'm asking for something specific. Well, we closed on that property this past Thursday, 2 days before October ended. Yes, God works in the future. Yes, heaven is going to be great. Yes, the Lord is going to give us eternal life. But God is still alive and well on planet Earth, and He's still doing miracles, and He's still answering prayer. He's still working on behalf of His children. Y'all remember when Drew and Danny went to Asia? Not long after he got to Thailand, he and Danny were befriended by a man we call Boy. Danny and Drew were kind of adopted by Boy and his parents. They later went to Myanmar, which is an impoverished country with poor health care. They barely got out of the country and back across the border to Thailand, where they would have better medical facilities because the border was closed. They made it out by just hours. Boy told Drew, don't worry about the COVID. I'm your brother. If you get back here, we'll take care of you. If we have to, I'll buy tents and we'll live in the jungle if we have to until this thing passes. Drew and Danny ended up staying in a cottage that Boy's parents had until they were able to come back to the States. And when it came time to leave, there were tears all around. And Boy's mom said she would miss her American sons. All the way on the other side of the world, God had our boys adopted by some complete strangers to keep them safe. God is still alive and well and at work in the world. By the way, Boy called Drew the other day. Boy's mom had fixed a meal and Boy told her it was too spicy. Boy's mom answered, my American son would like it. Martha, Lazarus will live. Martha, I'm not only working in the future, I'm working here today. God's timing is always perfect. You don't know how you will respond, so pray for protection. God's power and miracles are not limited to the future. And fourth, our pain does not go unnoticed. Look there again, if you will, please, in verse 32. Tom, read verses 32 through 35 for me, please.
My brother would not have died. When Jesus saw her weeping, and the Jews that had come along with her also weeping, he was deeply moved in spirit and troubled. Where have you laid him? He asked. Come and see, Lord, they replied. Jesus wept.
Jesus wept. Such a significant statement that it is set apart in a verse of its own. When the Bible was written, it was written on scrolls. Often each book was a different scroll. In the New Testament, the lines of Greek ran on and on with little punctuation or separation. There was no division between the words. The chapter divisions we use today were added by Stephen Langston, Archbishop of Canterbury in AD 1227. These Old Testament chapters were divided into verses by Rabbi Nathan in AD 1448. And the New Testament chapters were divided into verses by Robert Estienne, also known as Stephanus, in 1555. When Robert divided the chapters into verses, he recognized the significance of this verse, of this statement, and he set it apart as the shortest English verse in the Bible. Jesus wept. Why did Jesus weep? He knew what he was going to do. He knew that days before when they first told him Lazarus was sick. Back in verse 4, Jesus said this whole episode would not end with death, but that this was going to happen so that the Son of God might be glorified through it. Jesus knew what he was going to do. He knew how he was going to do it. He knew when he was going to do it. But that doesn't mean that he took the pain of Mary and Martha lightly. It does not mean that he discounted their tears. Jesus wept because Mary and Martha wept. My friend, there is pain and heartache and suffering in this world. That's the only way it could be if God was going to give us free will. In order to give us the opportunity to choose him, God also had to give us the opportunity to not choose him. And that decision by many in the world to not choose God has led to the pain and suffering we see in the world today. But that does not mean that God is unmoved. What parent can see a child fighting addiction and see their pain and not be moved? What parent can see their child choose a sorry person for a spouse and not be moved? My friend, the Bible tells us that Jesus looked over the city of Jerusalem and saw what it had become and the stupid choices the people were making and how it was going to turn out, and he wept for the city. Never think God is unmoved by your pain, your sorrow, and your heartache. Someday it will be fixed. In Revelation 21 verse 4 we are told he will wipe away every tear from their eyes. Death will be no more. Grief, crying, and pain will be no more because the previous things have passed away. A time will come when the tears will be dried, but we're not there yet. A number of years ago when Drew was just a child, he started having real bad leg pains. So we took him to the emergency room. When we got there, they told us he was dehydrated, so they were going to have to give him some fluids. Being young and dehydrated, they had a hard time finding a vein. They stuck that young child 6 times before they were able to find a vein. I still remember him looking up at me from that table with tears in his little eyes as they prepared to stick him again. And him asking me, "Daddy, do I have to?" Well, I can tell you that it was through tears that this dad said yes, knowing that it was necessary in order for him to get well. And my friend, I want you to know that when you are hurting, when you are in pain and don't understand, that it is only through tears that the Lord allows suffering to come your way, knowing that healing is on the way. God's timing is always perfect. You don't know how you will respond, so pray for protection. God's power is not limited to the future. Our pain does not go unnoticed. And fifth, nothing is beyond God's ability. Look there again, if you will, please, in verse 38. Then Jesus, deeply moved again, came to the tomb. It was a cave and a stone was lying against it. "Remove the stone," Jesus said. Martha, the dead man's sister, told him, "Lord, there is already a stench because he has been dead for 4 days." Jesus said to her, "Didn't I tell you that if you believed, you would see the glory of God?" Jesus told the folks, "Roll away the stone." And how did Martha respond? Jesus, he stinks. He's been dead 4 days. Jesus, if you had been here when he was sick, you could have healed him. Jesus, if you had been here when he died, perhaps you could have performed CPR. Perhaps you could have shocked him. Perhaps you could have restored life to him at that time. But it's way too late now. It's no longer possible. His body has already started breaking down. Jesus, he stinks. I have a friend named Randy Engelman. Randy is a nuisance animal trapper for the state of Florida. Randy used to like to go to the rendezvous, the reenactment where trappers would get together and remember the old mountain men that opened up the western part of the United States. Those guys would make their own coonskin caps and buckskin clothes and such. Well, Randy found out that our local rancher out in Oklahoma had had a buffalo die. So he asked the man if he could have the carcass. He wanted to hide for some clothes and wanted to do something with the tail, and he wanted to do something with the horns and with the hooves. And the rancher said, sure, you could have it. Well, it had been very cold and the buffalo was frozen. So Randy and his friend went and they cut the tail end off the buffalo, and then they took a chainsaw and decided they were going to cut the buffalo's head off. But the buffalo's hair got wrapped up in the chainsaw and the blade wouldn't turn anymore, and that didn't work. So finally they decided they'd just load that buffalo up and take it back to the house and deal with it a little bit later. Well, they made a mistake. You see, the buffalo was frozen on the outside, but not on the inside. And the inside had continued to break down. And Randy had just cut the back end, the tail off of that buffalo. So when they went to lift that buffalo into the back of the truck, the intestines ruptured, and all of that come out the back end of that buffalo and covered the two of them. And by the way, that's how Randy got his official Indian name, One Swollen Buffalo. The buffalo was dying, rotting on the inside. It stunk. And Martha says, Jesus, Lazarus has been in the grave for 4 days. It's too late. It's been too long. He stinks. My friend, I want you to know that when God is at work, nothing is impossible. Some of you have family members who are wrapped up in the world. They are so blinded by the things of the world and have embraced so many of the world's values that you feel they are a lost cause. You tell the Lord he is so much like the world, he stinks. Some of you have friends who are eaten up with addictions, and you tell the Lord she stinks. Some of you look at our country and you see the abortion and the sexual exploitation and the homosexuality in our twisted schools and our crooked politicians and our ignorant, deceived younger generation, and you say, God, she stinks. You look at police officers being attacked and looters on the streets and politicians trying to close churches and nastiness being taught to our children in many of our schools, and you say, God, she stinks. It's too late. It's too far gone. Isaiah chapter 59 verse 1, we are told, indeed the Lord's arm is not too weak to save, and his ear is not too deaf to hear. And in 2 Chronicles chapter 7 verse 14, we are promised, if my people, which are called by my name, shall humble themselves and pray and seek my face and turn from their wicked ways, then will I hear from heaven and will forgive their sin and heal their land. Perhaps the day will come when the Lord removes his hand from our country. Perhaps the day will come when our nation will be judged, but I've not given up hope. I've not thrown in the towel. Lord, our country stinks, but please do it again. Please do it again. God's timing is always perfect. You don't know how you will respond, so pray for protection. God's power is not limited to the future. Our pain does not go unnoticed. Nothing is beyond God's ability. And 6, the Lord doesn't always work like we expect. Had Jesus ever raised someone from the dead before who had been dead this long? No. He interrupted a funeral procession for a widow's only son one time and gave that man back his life. And Jesus healed Jairus' daughter, but that's not what he usually did. And he had certainly never called someone back from the grave after he'd already been laid to rest. Jesus usually healed people before they died. That's what Mary and Martha expected Jesus to do in this case. That's why they first sent word that Lazarus was sick. But that is not how Jesus chose to work in this case. He chose to do something different. And just because the Lord has chosen to work in a certain way in the past doesn't mean he's limited by our expectations. I was thinking about that the other day as one of our 4-H boys and his friend were in the chicken pen replacing a waterer. I was thinking about that the other day as a man and his son from our 4-H club were riding their motorcycles around the property. My word, whoever heard of hog pens at a church? Whoever saw a church with gingerbread people all over the place? The Lord doesn't always work the way we expect him to, nor the way he has worked in other situations. Our responsibility isn't to tell the Lord how he needs to work, but rather to look for where he is working and to join him in what he is doing. Abraham Lincoln once said, "I'm not concerned about whether or not the Lord is on my side. I'm more concerned about being on his side." Which leads us to the 7th lesson we learned from this account. We have a part to play. Look there again, if you will, please, in verse 41. So they removed the stone. Then Jesus raised his eyes and said, "Father, I thank you that you heard me. I know that you always hear me, but because of the crowd standing here, I've said this, so that they may believe you sent me." After he said this, he shouted with a loud voice, "Lazarus, come out." The dead man came out bound hand and foot with linen strips and with his face wrapped in a cloth. Jesus said to them, "Unwrap him and let him go." Verse 41, at Jesus' command, the people rolled the stone away. In verse 44, Jesus has the people unwrap Lazarus to let him go. Now, who brought Lazarus back to life? Hello? Who brought Lazarus back to life? Jesus did. Jesus did the work in his life. He's the one that called him from the tomb. Jesus is the one that performed the miracle. But before the transformation, the healing, the life restoration in Lazarus, Jesus had something for his people to do. And after Lazarus rose from the dead, Jesus had something for his people to do. He had them roll away the stone and he had them take off the grave clothes, take off the wrappings. My friends, Jesus is the only one who can change a heart. He is the only one who can open people's eyes and touch their hearts and change their lives. But he has a part for you to play in his work as well. Before our friends and family are given new lives, we live the part of salt and light in front of them, showing them what a life touched and impacted by the Lord looks like. We pray for them, we witness to them, we serve them. There's a part for us to play in their lives before life is restored to them. And afterwards, we disciple them, we teach them, and we continue to pray for them. Let me ask you this morning, what are you doing to roll away a stone so that someone else can live again? What are you doing to release them, to untie them? My friends, Christianity is not a spectator sport. It calls for all hands on deck. Would you this morning pray and ask the Lord, Lord, what would you have me do? Lord, what part am I to play in your kingdom?